Good morning, everyone. My name is Jeremy, and today we are talking about the first book in the Mistborn trilogy, The Final Empire. This book was so influential to me as a reader. Now, this is the book we are talking about, the very first one, The Final Empire in Mistborn, and we're going to be doing a pretty spoiler-free take on this. We're going to be talking about the book itself, so I mean there are certainly elements in here that we are discussing, but we're going to be overall trying to be spoiler free for you. The world of Mistborn I think is really interesting. Imagine if in like Middle Earth with Lord of the Rings, if they would have lost, and what change that would have on the landscape of Middle Earth if it would have been taken over. That's kind of where we start out with in this empire that is ruling all of Scadrial, which is the world that they live in. The Lord Ruler is this emperor being who is essentially seen as and worshipped as God. He is the ruling leader of the country, but not only that, he is a divinity and should not and cannot be questioned. Now, the world itself has some other elements that I think are pretty interesting. We're talking about the physical world itself. There are these ash mounts, is what they call them. Essentially, these large volcanoes that are putting out a ton of black ash. And that's something that is just everywhere. That is an aspect of life that people have to deal with. And there's constantly ash all over in the air that people are having to breathe, that because it's just everywhere, they have to try to clean it out. And there are like whole jobs that are dedicated to cleaning and clearing off the ash that's so prevalent and filling in this world. There's also brown plants. They talk about how at one time in the distant past, there might have been these plants that were green or things like flowers or stuff like that, but they just don't exist here in the world as we see it. All the plants are brown, and there's just like this dim dinginess to the physical appearance of those things. There's also a red sky, and that's interesting, either because of the haze from the ash or otherwise, but the sky and appearance of the sun are different than in the world we live in. And the final big thing about the world in its physical appearance is this mystical aspect of the mist that comes out during the night, and there are no like stars in the sky or things like that because it's always covered by this mist. And again, in these ancient records that people can pull out, they talk about stars. They've heard of them in their legends, but they cannot see them because of the mist. The mist, generally speaking, only comes out at night and is pretty pervasive in all of exterior type locations, but doesn't really enter in on inside of buildings or things like that. So there's some level of mysticalness with this mist. So that's the world that we are set in, but the world is even darker and more challenging than that. And that's where we start out in this story. We start at a slave encampment. Now, there are slaves everywhere. In fact, the entire race of Ska, which are these group of people that is the majority of the population, are all considered slaves owned by the Lord Ruler. And they are led and controlled by a race called nobles. And these are individuals that are seen as different than the regular Ska population, and they are able to be taskmasters, have all these other types of privileges of kind of this ruling population, and all of the Ska are essentially subject to their whims. And this is the first scene that we see, is this slave encampment. They're working in the fields, and we get a taste of this world and its darker nature as there's this extreme disparity between these different groups of people. we meet Kelsier, who is a rebellious Ska, and we then find that he has a plan for a job that is essentially going to fight back against the noble people and also the rule of law, the government itself. And that is where we shift into this story to its main aspects of the story. Now, this is totally a fantasy, but it pulls really heavily from the elements of a heist movie. Like, in a heist, you have these group of different individuals with these specialties and their skills, and then from there, you make a plan of how you're going to execute it, and then you go about it, and then there's going to be stuff that like happens that throws the plan off on its side, and that's all here in this fantasy story. Now, the other major characters that I think are really important to talk about here a little bit is Vin. Now, Vin is this young street urchin girl who has some special abilities and is ultimately found by Kelsier and his crew and is brought in, and ultimately we learn about the magic system, about the world as we explore it through her eyes. And Vin is such a lovable character. Like, I just want to give her a hug and tell her the world's going to be okay. And she comes from this really hard, difficult background. She essentially does not trust people because people have betrayed her. And the world that she grew up in as a child was one where you backstab people before they stab you. You cheat people before they cheat you. She essentially was in a group of Ska that were a little less controlled, and there were thieves and others that tried to take advantage of some of the outlying aspects of the government or of business trade, and they're in these thieving crews. Another character that's really important to talk about is Elend. Elend is in the group of noble people, right? He is from this group that is seen as a leader and to have advantages that the Ska do not have. And there we see that they hold balls and have parties and control the economy and do all those types of things. And we see some of those things as we interact with Elend in this story. With the Lord Ruler, he is a big character that needs to be talked about just because of his impact, the level of fear. When people like swear, they swear by the Lord Ruler, like by the Lord Ruler, or things like that, and they use him in their common speech. He's constantly feared, and anytime that he'd make a physical appearance, he has the capacity to overwhelmingly make fear or awe inside of the crowds that he is showing himself to. Another individual that's so important to talk about is this character named Sazed. Now, Sazed is a terraceman, and a terraceman in the society world right now are a race of individuals that are most commonly used as stewards or servants that are like a higher class of servants. So the Ska are maybe the individuals that are out working in the fields or in the mines or doing some of that really heavy labor intensive work in order to be able to maintain the economy and the lifestyle of the noble class. And Sazed, with being a terraceman, is someone who would be like a chaperone or a instructor for the noble class, and they are servants that would officiate in those type of duties, and that's how their race has been used and applied in the society that we see ourselves in inside of Mistborn. So this is a fantasy story, and we haven't really talked too much yet about the magic system. So the magic system has two major subgroups in what's called Allomancy and also Feruchemy. Those are the two major magics that exist in this book that's really discussed. There is a third called Hemalurgy, which is shown but not really explored and talked about in this particular volume, so we're not going to be talking about Hemalurgy very much. So with Allomancy, that's the primary magic system. Allomancy is where you consume trace metal, so a little flecks of metal, and depending on what that metal was, you consume it or burn it, is the term that they use, and that fuels your magic. And so someone who is a misting has the capacity to burn one type of metal, and a Mistborn is able to burn all types of metal. So if someone was a tin eye or a misting who was only able to burn tin, they could use that type of magic, but they couldn't use pewter, which has a different type. So these function in different type of ways. So a tin eye is someone who can burn tin, and all of their senses go overdrive. They can see better, they can hear better, they're more sensitive to hot or cold. All of their senses are amplified. And then you have someone like a pewter arm. And a person burning pewter is someone who is able to increase their strength. Also, their senses are a little bit more dulled by effect. But a pewter arm is someone who would be able to lift really, really heavy things, or if they were to punch somebody, it would be a really, really powerful punch. And so each of these different abilities make people have different specialties, which ties into the aspect that this story has of being a bit of a heist inside of the story, is because there's these different people with these special skills, and they come together all together to build out this crew. And thus you have, like in a heist movie, you'd have somebody who's really good with technology and hacking, and then you have someone who can open up safes, and someone who is a bit of a con individual and gets access to certain things, or different type of specialties inside of that thieving crew. You have that here, except their specialties are in their magic. And I think that was super cool and interesting and totally unique. So one of the other magics that I said we would maybe talk a little bit about is Feruchemy. And I don't want to go too much into this. It's one that I think is probably best to be explored inside of the book itself, but essentially it uses metals in a different way. Rather than being able to burn and use the energy from the metal, they use it to store their own energy, thus being able to be strong by storing in their strength and being weak for a time and things like that. And who can use that power and where it comes from is something I don't really want to reveal all the way here, but something definitely to look for and explore while you're reading the book. Overall, the pacing, the characterization, the story were all fantastic. In fact, I have read so many books in 2020 for novels itself. We're not talking fiction, we're not talking comics or things like that, just novels itself. I think I read about 200 of them. And as I started my new year, I allowed myself to reread a couple of books, and especially in the intent of being able to do reviews and talking about them here on the channel. And going back to Mistborn, I am like, wow, the pacing of this book is so good. It's just a step above so many other books that I have read. At least for me, it just does that so, so well. Additionally, the way that things are described, the ways I felt about the characters, emotionally getting attached to them or caring about them or hurting when they're hurting, all of those types of things were really, really well done, because it affected me, at a certain emotional level that was extremely satisfying as a story. I love this book. I think it's one that I would recommend for everybody as a reader. I think it has some amazing aspects, and if you don't really read fantasy, I think I'd recommend it because one, you should be reading outside of what you're most comfortable with at times, and I think this one just does some really important and like interesting things that you as a reader will feel really satisfied coming off of. Now, if you do like fantasy, epic fantasy, shorter fantasy, YA fantasy, all of those type of categories, read this book. You will be so glad that you did. I highly recommend it. It is one of my all-time favorite books, and every time I've returned to it, I have been so happy and excited. One of the other magics that I mentioned briefly was Feruchemy, and that is one of the other magics that I should mention. Thank you guys so much for watching. I really appreciate you spending the time with me today. If you guys enjoy this, maybe consider subscribing. I'd love to be able to share more book recommendations and other type of content with you like that. Now, I'm also on other social media platforms like Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at Nerd Morning, and you can find me there. Also, if you choose, you're welcome to support me, and you're able to do that by going to www.patreon.com/nerdmorning. Thank you guys so much again for watching, and we'll catch you guys next time.